think what we should do is start. How does that sound, everyone? And I'll keep an eye on the waiting room and on the chat room as well. Welcome, everyone. We have Michigan and Illinois represented here tonight, and actually Omaha, correct?
Yeah, yeah. Indeed.
And who knows who else. Last night on a virtual tasting that was Michigan-based, we also had people who were online coming from Virginia on the East Coast. So we're thrilled to see everyone. I'm Madeline Trifon, and I'm proud to be the sommelier for Plum Market, both in Michigan and Illinois, which at least for the moment is Chicago. Stay tuned. We evidently are going to have stores in Washington, DC and LA, but not next year, you know. This extraordinary year has put a little bit of a break on expansion for the moment, but we are, as you know, an upmarket grocery store. So knock on wood, we've been busy, and the people who work the stores, we're very proud of them. They are our frontline heroes. This is our first and only virtual spirits tasting of 2020. So in this, what anyone would call, by anybody's measure, an extraordinary year. I am not leading this tasting tonight because I am a Scotch, not innocent, ignorant, but definitely I can't go down any rabbit holes because I just learned to say Glenmorangie correctly. Yes, I've been saying Glenmorangie just like other people, I'm sure.
A lot of people, most people really.
Like most people. We have a full-fledged expert, Dan Crowell, who's going to be joining us. And we also have members of our team that I want to mention. We have Rebecca Miles Steiner, who is our spirits buyer. She's waving, and she's actually at Plum Market Old Town as we speak. She's the one who championed this tasting. So thank you, Rebecca. And you know, Rebecca has worked on premise as sommelier at City Winery. She's been our spirits buyer for almost a year now, yay, with happy success. And she's passed her advanced WSCT. She's passed her Court of Master Sommeliers certified, and she's working on WSCT 4 and a couple of other certification. My money is completely on you, Rebecca, and your people who are studying are little walking encyclopedias. God bless you, because that means I can just turn to you and ask the question. And you're a delight to work with. So happy to have you on our team. We also have our spirits buyer from Michigan. I don't see her, but I know she's in on the tasting, Robin Westfall. I used to work with Robin in my previous incarnation in Michigan restaurants, and she's been our spirits buyer now for several years. And if you want to unmute yourself and say hello, Robin, you can, but if you're feeling shy, that's okay too. Let me quick check and make sure there's nobody in the waiting room. I think we're good for the moment. We've also got Rebecca Kelly, who is our portfolio specialist representing Moet Hennessy. Part of which is Glenmorangie. Moet Hennessy has exquisite taste, so they tend to have only luxury brands under their umbrella. And Rebecca is also a certified sommelier, and I was thrilled to work with her on events when I was coming to Chicago with regularity. Now we get to work with her in this incarnation of her profession. So. We may have Joanna Breslin and Jeff Richards on in the background. I'm not entirely sure. They're part of the wine team buyer and our wine team leader respectively. So that said, a couple of pieces of housekeeping before I forget. You know, I like to overstate the obvious. Everyone, I think you're muted. If you want to ask a question, you can unmute yourself. It's, yes, Jeff is lurking in the comments. Good. Happy to see you, Jeff. Just wait till we ask for questions, and then by all means unmute yourself. You know, there's no wine or Scotch police here tonight, but it's just background noise more than anything else. You can keep the questions coming in the chat room, and I'll keep an eye on them, Dan, and so will Plum Rebecca, and so will Rebecca Kelly, just so we can feed them to you. There is a little bit of difference in the accessibility of Scotches in Michigan and Chicago, because, hi, Robin, there you are.
Hi.
Actually, Robin has run in-person Glenmorangie tastings at the Michigan West Bloomfield store. So she's kind enough to sit in on our virtual tonight.
That's great.
The taster kits were available in Chicago, but not in Michigan. So the Michigan folk purchased one or more of the scotches, but in 750s. So, you know, whatever scotch you have is just fine. And you can go ahead and if you have a taster kit, pour either, you know, a half to 3/4 of an ounce of each. If you don't have 4 glasses, no, never mind. We can reuse them. And it's ideal if you have a glass of uniced water, preferably filtered or bottled, and a straw or an eyedropper. Not essential, but so that you can, you know, add a little water if you feel like it per Dan's direction. Ice is really optional. He's not going to be using any. In terms of what we're going to do, Dan's going to start by reviewing how to best taste for appreciation. You know, I'm all into like learning how to do it right for selfish pleasure, right? And depth of perception. But then we won't address the 4 scotches directly until later in the presentation, maybe 20 minutes, 30 minutes. But again, you can, you know, taste along as you like. We're going to try to keep this to about an hour. Historically, I run a little late. I'm, you know, eternally on Greek time. Dan, is your timing okay? Can you hang with us?
Sure. Yeah.
A little bit later and answer questions?
I'd be glad to.
I think, did I forget anything? I think I've covered it all. Yay. So we can get on with the business of having fun. And I just want to tell you a little bit about our special guest, Dan Crowell, who has originally his family's, at least half of his family is from Ireland, has been a brand ambassador for Glenmorangie and Ardbeg. Ardbeg, is that how you say
Ardbeg,
it?
perfectly, yes.
Since 2014, but he also has, God love you, extensive bar and restaurant experience. That makes us appreciate you even more because you understand it's what it's like to, you know, have hands that are very muscular and feet.
Yes,
well.
Indeed.
He's got a general certificate in distilling. He's a certified specialist of spirits, a certified Scotch professional and whiskey specialist. He's WSET level 2, so you get to play with wine as well. Yay. And this is exciting. You're going to take your Master of Scotch exam in May of 2021.
If COVID allows it, yes, we will. It will be part of the first.
Yes.
Yeah, the first classes, the first sitting class of Masters of Scotch candidates. So
That's
we all have our fingers crossed.
That's
aggressively.
Thrilled. So how many are there now in the world?
There aren't any yet. This will be the first. Yeah. So the Council of Whiskey Masters is a new certification organization backed by some of the real luminaries in the industry, including our master distiller, Dr. Bill Lumsden, who will be on the judging panel for these exams. But this will be the first class of Masters of Scotch candidates that'll go through the program.
This is thrilling. Wow.
So yeah, I'm terrified, completely petrified, but really excited for the challenge. It should be a lot of fun.
Well, if you don't mind my sharing something very quickly before I pass it over to you, and you know, I remember when I went to take my Master Sommelier exam, and I just couldn't speak. I was so terrified, and my best friend looked at me and said, "Don't be afraid." And I thought, how am I going to do that? You know, and I just thought practically, I'm going to ignore it. And I did. So it's possible to just ignore it, you know?
Yeah. I think it really does come down to just sort of living in the moment and remembering your training and remembering your passion, why you do it, remembering your love for the liquid. And that really carries the day, I think.
Well, we're thrilled to have you here, and you've got a virtual room full of people who are supporting you. Welcome. Awesome. Big Midwestern virtual hug from us. And if we were in person, it would be actual. And we're very much looking forward to everything you have to share, Dan.
Thank you, Madeline. I've been looking forward to this one for a while. I've worked with Plum Market in Old Town in Chicago on a number of occasions, and those events are always really fun, well curated events. The food is terrific. They're very helpful, and they always go off without a hitch. And I'm sure that this one's going to go exactly the same way in the virtual world. As Madeline said, I like the whole idea. I do and I don't. The idea of Scotch police, but I think people worry about. Or am I doing it right? And is this the accepted methodology? It turns out you can do whatever you want. You have at your disposal the greatest aromatic and flavor recognition tools on the planet. And that's really all you need. You need a glass, some whiskey, your face, and a mindset set to exploration. After that, we can help to a degree to enhance the value of your relationship with the liquid with a few of the things that we'll talk about this evening. But if you don't walk away with any other thing that I may have blathered out of my head this evening, it's that you're already pre-qualified to be awesome at this. The rest of this is just icing on the cake. So with that, I'm going to do a quick share screen and we'll talk a bit about aromatics and flavor profile recognition, the physiology behind that. And I hope that you find it enlightening as I did when I got taken through this. Oops, I just stopped sharing screen.
And
okay,
I'm interrupting you. I forgot to tell everyone, if you want, we're on Brady Bunch chat room style tonight, just because it's cozy. We don't have 100 people, which is lovely. I like it this way. But if you want to, especially during the presentation, I'd suggest selecting speaker view in your upper right-hand corner. That way you can just see Dan talking. So that said, all yours. And
excellent.
What an tongue, my goodness.
That's a really aesthetically pleasing tongue. I have to give it to this person, who I assume is a woman. I can't really tell, but yeah, great tongue. The reason that we wanted to point out some of the physiological aspects of flavor profile and aromatic recognition is that they're sometimes misunderstood. The things that your nose is good at, the things that your mouth is good at, and the things that your brain is good at telling you are three sort of different areas. Your palate, where your papillae live, your taste buds, they're good for these 5 things and a couple other key elements. Your mouth, where taste is going to happen, and taste and flavor are in fact 2 related but different things. Taste is going to tell you the ones that you learned in 8th grade biology class: sweet, salty, sour, bitter, and umami. When I was in 8th grade, that was not a word, but now it is. So it's your papillae all have sensors for all those things. It's just that some of them are better at one than others in various groups around the mouth. It's not the only thing your palate does. It will tell you things about texture. No matter how much you smell a whiskey, you're not going to get its texture. You don't have a sense of its viscosity until you have it on the palate. Its alcoholic potency can get hinted to you through the aromatics, but it's only really going to manifest itself on the palate. So your palate is good for some stuff, and you want to make sure that it has an opportunity to do the things that it's good at to the best of its ability. It's really your nose where things are going to get very interesting. You see the diagram that points out the olfactory epithelium. That little bit of apparatus is, yes, where all aromatic recognition is going to be derived, but somewhere between 80 and 90% of what flavor recognition is going to be derived there too. So if aroma is its own thing that the olfactory epithelium takes care of, taste is a thing that your papillae take care of, then flavor is a delicate dance performed between your olfactory epithelium, your palate, and your brain that assembles all those messages together to give you a picture of flavor. If you have a cold or there isn't sufficient airflow over your olfactory epithelium, you can't really taste stuff very well at all. And the reason for that is the oversized role the olfactory bulb plays in flavor recognition. You can see there in the diagram 10,000 different aromas, and that's just walking up off the street, anybody, anytime. Women physiologically, the olfactory epithelium is the same size, but the number of sensors, the density of sensors in the olfactory epithelium in women is higher.
A lot higher?
It's a good 3 to 4 times higher in terms of it's the concentration of sensors. And that goes back to It was very important in terms of the sanctity of the household. If you're living in, a cave or whatever, if you're the person to recognize, wow, that meat is rancid, or the forest is on fire, or whatever, then the family survives. Cave man showing up with this rancid deer carcass and the forest is on fire, he doesn't realize it. That isn't very helpful. It's just keeping your family from burning in a forest fire. But the matronly element of the family has a better sense of those things historically for that reason. And now you get to benefit. The risk of forest fire, depending on where you live, is fairly low. And being handed a rancid deer carcass is also relatively low at this point. But you get to benefit from the evolutionary aspect of what happened over the course of human evolution. So we move on from there. What I will do is I'm going to stop sharing for a second, and we're going to go through what I affectionately refer to as my whiskey golf swing. So I'm going to quickly stop share, and then we're going to go through this. Now I'm going to work through this with Glenmorangie Original, this one, the one that looks a bit like that. If you've got me in speaker view, it'd be a little bit easier to see. But this is our flagship expression, which we'll talk a bit more about in more specifics a little bit later in the presentation. But for
if
now,
people don't have this, they can use whatever Scotch they have.
Anyone that you'd like. Exactly right. So you can use any of the whiskeys at your disposal to go through this thing, this whiskey golf swing thing. And the reason that I refer to it is that it's mine. It's the one that I've developed and the one that works for me. It doesn't mean that it has to be the one that you develop or the one that works for you. If it informs the way that you develop your relationship with the liquid, terrific. That's the best case scenario. But you can take all of it and kind of put it to one side if you'd like. This is just what works for me. So I tend to, you drink with all your senses, your eyes, your ears, you hear this, and that means the day just got a whole lot better. So all senses are working here. Just like you eat with your eyes, you drink with your eyes. This, if you can kind of get a sense of what's going on in the glass there. The color of a whiskey can tell you some fairly significant stories about what you might be able to expect in the glass. We'll get into that in just a bit. But I'm going to, after I've drawn some conclusions from the visuals, again, which we'll talk about in a bit, I'm going to start with aromatic recognition just to see what's going on in this glass. Now, from a wine perspective, you're usually dealing with an ABV of 15% or less. With distilled spirits, it could be a whole lot more than that. And the trouble with that is that the higher the ABV of a liquid, the more high volatiles, the more high volatiles are in the glass, and they evaporate relatively quickly out of the glass. So if you have a cask strength or a high proof whiskey in your glass, there's going to be a lot of vaporized alcohol sitting there in the glass, sort of waiting to melt your face off. And the trouble with alcohol vapors, as lovely as they are, is that they can also be an anesthetic. So in high concentrations on the olfactory epithelium, you can start to get yourself shut down a little bit. So I'm just going to approach this with some delicacy. Now, I know that this is 43 ABV or 86 proof, so there's no real danger of this taking my face off. As a matter of fact, the highest ABV or proof that we'll deal with tonight is 92 or 46 ABV. So we're not going to have a tremendous amount of, if this was cask strength, it'd be a different story. But I'm not necessarily going to go burying my nose in a whiskey that I don't know what's in the glass. I'm just going to approach it somewhat slowly. I tend to leave my mouth open as I'm breathing in through my nose and mouth. And you have two different rates of airflow on either side of your nose, the dominant side and the recessive side. And that changes throughout the course of the day. There's a set of tissues back there that regulates how much air can go up either side of your nose at any given point. So if you breathe in from the diaphragm through your nose, you'll discover that you've got one side that's got better airflow than the other. There's a physiological reason for that. The dominant side gives you a lot of information, but that information is moving quickly across the olfactory bulb. The recessive side exists to restrict and slow down that air movement to give your olfactory epithelium a better opportunity to pick subtlety out of that airflow. So I tend to want to get both sides involved, recognizing that each is going to give me a slightly different message. So I tend to be a kind of a hoverer and a sort of breathe in through the nose and mouth person. The reason I'm leaving my mouth open is to get some circular airflow, but also that if you get your mouth open as you're breathing in through your nose and mouth, there's only so much air that can go up your nose. In case that happens to be a high ABV liquid, you're not going to blow your face off.
You know, I go back and forth with wine too. I'm really happy to hear you talk about this, because I find that my ability to smell changes depending on the time of day or my health.
Time of day is huge too. It doesn't sound all that responsible, but morning is the best time to evaluate a whiskey. Which sounds like you're doing something professional and important, except that you're drinking in the morning. So it works out relatively well. So, and you can isolate if you want to. You can isolate each nostril and kind of decide for yourself which gives you what kinds of signals. I tend to find that the recessive side gives me more barrel and more floral, and the dominant side gives me a little bit more of the meaty, the fruity center of a whiskey.
Is the recessive the same on each person, or does it depend?
No, it'll switch throughout the day. So whatever at the time, whatever's got better airflow is there. It's not like being right-handed from softball or something. It'll change throughout the course of the day. Cool. It's my ENT told me it's called nasal cycling. So you get this kind of thing that happens slowly throughout the course of the day. And if pollen, if you've got allergies and stuff, that'll mess with it. But if you're relatively clear, then just a nose full will give you a sense of what to expect. So then you got a sense of what's happening in the aromatics, a couple, three sort of approaches and some lungfuls in. And you're drawing yourself a picture. I tend to, throughout the course of this thing, as long as I'm, in an environment I'm familiar with, I usually close my eyes for most of it because of the five senses in terms of sensory bandwidth being taken up in your brain. Visuals are the big one. Dogs have 100 times the aromatic senses in their noses that humans do. So they see the world through the noses. We, being visual creatures, that's the big bandwidth hog here. So if you take it away, the other ones have a little bit more bandwidth to work with in terms of sensory decoding.
What a cool suggestion. I do that automatically with wine.
That's the thing.
Self-concentrate. It's very neat.
Yep. Yeah, and it's a little meditative, as far as this goes. It doesn't always have to be a ritual. It's a bit like watching Citizen Kane. It's not like you're in film school every time you watch it. But if you want to go to film school by watching that film, it can be exhilarating. Just trying to pick apart, okay, wow. Orson Welles was the first guy to use this camera angle to make this scene look like this, and he's revered still for it. It's a great story, but it's a fascinating work of the state of the filmmaker's art. This is the same thing. It's a beautiful story being told to you in a nonverbal and liquid way, but it's also a fascinating look into the state of the distiller's art. It's a bit like owning a UHD TV 4K thingy. You don't always have to want to know how many eyebrow hairs the evening news anchor has, but your TV, when you're ready to count them, your TV is ready to deliver that amount of clarity to you, or you can just sit and watch the news. I kind of feel like that about whiskey. You can just sit and have your relationship with this, or you can really, really dig in. And this is whiskey golf swing happens when I'm looking to dig in. So once I have a sense of the aromatics and I've drawn myself a picture, the aromatics can tell you a lot about what the whiskey is going to be. And it might tell you some things about what it isn't. Like, this is not a peated whiskey. There's nothing smoky about it. So that entire segment of aromatics is missing. So I could draw some conclusions from the lack of smoke. But I may be surprised by some things that are presenting themselves on the aromatics that may or may not show up on the palate. So now I'm going to the sort of the addressing of the ball, liquid on the palate. I'm going to drop a little onto the palate, and I want to roll it around a little. I want to get all my papillae covered, the cheeks and stuff, so that you can get some feedback in terms of its viscosity, its spiciness, its alcoholic potency. But I also, this works really well with wine too. If you draw a little air in through your teeth and you want to sort of aerate and agitate while it's in there for a couple of reasons, because the aerative reaction helps the whiskey to sort of bloom in your mouth. Secondarily, the agitation is creating vapor in there. This is one way to get information under your olfactory bulb. This is the other, your retronasal passages in the back of your throat. But they don't work on liquid, or you start to really drown in whiskey. They work on vapor. So if, as you swallow, you have quite a lot of vapor built up in your mouth, then we can manipulate your breathing to drive as much information-rich, vapor-rich airflow across your olfactory bulb in the flavor phase to give you a real clear picture. So this is how that goes. I'm gonna draw some onto the palate, roll it around, breathe in, suck a little air in through my teeth, not breathe in, but suck a little air in through my teeth, rattle things around 5-6 seconds, let it tell its story. Then I'm gonna swallow, give myself a second for everything to adjust, and then a big lungful in through the mouth and a nice slow exhale through the nose with your eyes closed. It's during the exhale, because you've generated all those vapors, it's during the exhale through your nose that the flavor message can't get any clearer. It's physiologically how you are working with the tools at your disposal the most efficiently and effectively. So we'll try it. It looks a little like this. If I could talk and do it at the same time, I would, but I can't. Swallow, breathe in. Slow exhale through the nose. As soon as the exhale starts, you start to, the flavors start to stratify themselves in your head, and you can begin to pick them apart at the seams. That's a little bit like the first time you go to see, say, Star Wars. You can never unsee it. You can never re-see it for the first time. Sometimes pulling things apart at the seams, like I went to music school and music was never the same after that, because you can't just sit back and listen to it as a complete piece anymore. You're wondering, wow, that the oboe in the third movement, what a crushingly beautiful melody that is. And so you can't really just see it as its whole picture anymore. So once you start pulling this stuff apart at the seams, it's a little difficult to go back. So just proceed down that road with a certain amount of caution and with a grain of salt, in as much as this is really just supposed to be, it's supposed to wash over you with layers of glory and awesome.
No, that was so useful. Thank you very much for holding our hand through that, because I just learned a different way of tasting spirits. Much appreciated.
Yeah. Oh, and there's one other thing that you can do if you're into this kind of stuff. I lost it. Where did it go? Oh, there it is. You can use an aerator. You can use a spirit aerator if you want. If you can find one of these, they're pretty neat. It's basically the same idea as a wine aerator, except it has a button, so you can fill the hopper up and then move across different sets of glasses. But one of the things that does is to help the high volatile alcohols blow out a solution a little bit more readily, so that a whiskey is a little bit less sharp right after you pour it.
Cool.
So the follow through of that whiskey golf swing is really water. And water is one of those things that's entirely, like everything else in the whiskey experience, entirely up to you. If you decide that water is the bosom chum of that whiskey, then you're right. And if you decide that it isn't, then you're also right. The only real way to know is if you drink the whiskey and you look at your face in the mirror, and then you gauge the severity of your smile, and then you add water, and then you drink it again and you look in the mirror. And if your smile is bigger, then it was the right thing to do. And if it's less big, then maybe it wasn't the right thing to do. But what water is a catalyst, a chemical catalyst for change. Water tends to, in very broad degrees, tends to give advantage to the barrel and the floral elements that would have been generated in the fermentation phase, and barrel elements that would have been generated in the maturation phase. And it can serve, doesn't always, serve to suppress a little bit of the center palate fruitiness or esterification that would have happened in all three phases of the production of that whiskey: maturation, distillation, and fermentation, distillation, and maturation. So I welcome you to experiment with water. The thing about adding water to whiskey is like going and getting a haircut. If it goes well, then everybody's happy. But if it doesn't, you sort of live with the result. You can't uncut your hair, then you can't unadd water to a whiskey. So if the water, and this is what it comes down to at some point, is how much water goes into a whiskey. As much as makes you happy is the answer. But that answer is going to change a bit technically based on the bottling strength of the whiskey, the age of the whiskey, and your palate preferences. This at 43 ABV, I'm not going to add much at all. There's already plenty of water in there. It just wasn't added very recently. So what I'm looking to do is to create a chemical catalyst for change in the moment. And then I'm gonna go back to the whiskey golf swing and see what I think of it. Did it materially improve? Is it just different? Is it not better or worse, only different? And that's the realm of your domain. The thing that I love most about drinking whiskey, aside from drinking whiskey, is that you are autonomous and you are infallible. You can do whatever the hell you want with it, and you're always right. So that
Well,
I
I
love.
used a little bit of water and it made it easier for me to perceive the flavor, and it also
Yep.
changed the mouthfeel a little bit. I am going to nudge us to move us along.
Perfect. That's great.
A
So
healthy
let's.
story to tell us, not the least of which is why you have a giraffe next to the bottle. So
Oh yes,
I'm
that's an
going to
important
move
story.
us along. Yes.
Yes, good. So now that we've got all of that kind of out of the way, we can dig into some of the nuts and bolts regarding how these whiskeys are, where they come from, how they're assembled, and what the terms mean. Let me just go to the actual presentation here. So just to define some stuff, the definition of whiskey, regardless of how it's spelled, a distillate spirit distilled from fermented cereals and aged in wooden casks for a period of time. Everybody around the world has basically agreed on that. You can find some countries that put some stuff in a bottle that's called whiskey and it's actually made from sugar cane, and it's really frowned upon, but it happens. Nearly everybody's agreed to just make it a distillate based on fermented cereal grains. So we move from there, then we're going to start defining the difference between single malt Scotch whiskey and just good old whiskey. Here's Scotch. So that's Scotland. You can see where Glenmorangie is there in the North Highlands, just about an hour north of Inverness, and about 2 hours north of the Speyside subdistrict, the one that everybody's probably heard of. If you've heard of any of the districts of Scotland, you'd find Glenfiddich and Glenlivet and Macallan and Balvenie all in Speyside. We're north of there. So yes, to be a Scotch, we're not even into single malt yet, but to be a Scotch, it's got to be distilled and aged in Scotland. Got to be at least 3 years in an oak cask. That cask, for the record, can't be bigger than 700 liters of interior volume. And yeah, so there's a limit there, and that's generally about the limit of an Oloroso sherry butt, although that the Oloroso sherry butts are closer to 600 liters. But there's the reason for that is you start to get out of whack in terms of the wood to liquid ratio, and it doesn't mature in a way that renders a result that tastes like Scotch anymore. And then in terms of age statements, the youngest, the number on the bottle represents the youngest whiskey in that bottle. If you buy a bottle of Glenmorangie 18, not everything is exactly 18 years. There'll be some 19 and some 20 and some 21 to try to achieve some level of continuity, but everything's at least 18 years, or it would be illegal to put that number on the bottle in Scotland. So if we move from there, we've just got 3 ingredients to work with. If you discount wood and thyme, because those aren't really ingredients so much as they are influencers, you have water, barley, and yeast. That is all we get. So every single malt Scotch whiskey that you drink is really just made from 3 ingredients. And the number of distilleries, the number of the products coming from each of those distilleries, the number of variants in those bottles is mind-boggling, given that you only have 3 ingredients. So that covers our recipe, at least. This is Glenmorangie. This is Glenmorangie in the coastal North Highlands of Scotland. There's our water reservoir that runs down off the hill, off the Torlogie Springs, which we'll talk about in just a sec. Bunch of barrels. So what does single mean? Single, those 4 words mean 4 different things. Single means that it comes from one distillery. In this case, Glenmorangie. Almost all the time when you're looking at a bottle of single malt Scotch whiskey, the name on the bottle is the name of the distillery, 98% of the time. And this is one of those times. Glenmorangie is, in fact, our distillery. So if you move to malt, the only grain that you can use in a single malt Scotch whiskey is malted barley. You can malt other grains, but the only grain that you can use to create single malt Scotch whiskey is malted barley. There are lots of geeky reasons for that we go into in length if this was a 5-hour presentation. Suffice it to say, Scotland is prime barley growing environment, and at Glenmorangie, with the exception of the To Sail, which we'll talk about in just a bit, all of the barley that we use to create Glenmorangie comes from Scotland, so it's all Scottish barley. So moving to the term Scotch, there's Scotland, of course, a lovely place. Scotch, yes, we'd already discussed that. It needs to be distilled and matured for at least 3 years in Scotland in an oak container of less than 700 liters of interior volume. And then whiskey, we've covered that before, a distillate derived from cereal grains and aged in a barrel. This, in case it came up in conversation, or if you find yourself in cash cab and they ask you, Lindor's Abbey is the birthplace of Scotch whiskey. If you go back to 1494, it was the first time that the idea of whiskey was documented. The friar there named John Core was allotted a whole bunch of barley, about 4 tons of barley, to create a distillate from, and that became the very first instance of aquavitae in Scotland, documented anyway. How the term become whiskey, Ushkaba is the Scots Gaelic term for water of life. And if you try to say that while having too much water of life, it starts to sound like whiskey. So here we are at our first Glenmorangie, the original, the one that I had shown you before, the one I used for the whiskey golf swing. In case it came up and Madeline was nice enough to, I don't know if you can hear that, but that's the real pronunciation, Glenmorangie. It's tempting. It is very tempting to pronounce it Glenmorangie, and as a matter of fact, nearly everyone does. Glenfiddich is the number 1 single malt in the world. We're number 4. They're the most frequently mispronounced single malt in the world, and we're number 2 in that regard.
Now you rolled your R. Can you say it again, just the way?
Yes, Glenmorangie. Yeah. So if you're in the coastal North Highlands, yeah. If you're Glaswegian, if you're in the south, along the Highland line where Glasgow is, there's a certain set of dialects there that honestly does pronounce it Glenmorangie. And I got told that in very forceful terms by a Glaswegian at an event. And all I could say back was, the people that work there pronounce it Glenmorangie. So I'm going to go with them in that regard. So established in 1843 by our friend William Matheson. Next week is his wedding anniversary. I want to say it's December 18th, 1839. Just in case you're keeping track of those kinds of things, which I would question, but we welcome that sort of thing. So a beautiful place. It's been around now 187 years. This fella, Dr. Bill Lumsden, the only guy to be named ISC Master Distiller of the Year more than twice, and he's now won it 4 times in the last 5 years.
What's ISC?
International Spirits Competition.
It's a big deal that he's won it for.
Yeah, it's a really big deal. They're big fans of his, and of course, he's really rewritten the rule books in terms of how whiskey gets made in Scotland. He's started a number of trends. He's perfected a number of techniques that are used widely around the industry now, including one that we'll talk about here in just a second with the Lasanta, Quinta, Ruban, and Nectar d'Or, that being secondary maturation or wood finishing. So he's not kidding here. He does get bored quickly, very quickly. So the range of Glenmorangie expressions in the core range, in the experimental range, those are reflective of Bill's very, very curious and active mind. So one of the things that makes Glenmorangie unique, not better. The thing about water is that in Scotland, almost all the water that's used in processing and creating whiskeys is soft water, i.e. not much dissolved minerality in the water. It rains a lot in Scotland. So a lot of water is just running off the saturated ground into lakes, rivers, and streams, and then used by distilleries, either as cooling water, as a fermentation base, or as the water that gets that they'll use to cut to strength to add to the barrels or to the bottles eventually. Ours is hard water. It doesn't make whiskey better. It's just a different environment, different fermentation environment for yeast. Lots of calcium and magnesium, dissolved calcium magnesium salts in that water. It's quite a lot similar to the water in Burton-on-Trent in England. It's considered really good beer making water because of the dissolved minerality. And you might find, if you're beer makers at home, this is pre-Burtonized water. Basically, it's got a lot of the same chemical elements that the water in Burton-on-Trent, considered some of the best beer making water in the world, has. We and our friends at Highland Park are the only whiskey distilleries in Scotland that benefit from spring-fed hard water resources to create our whiskeys. Again, not better, just different. Just a thing to keep in mind. So this is a diagram of how that goes. But a drop of rainwater near the springs is going to turn into spring water in about 100 years. That gives you an idea of how it interacts with the unexposed geology. The reason that happens at Glenmorangie and Highland Park, almost everywhere in Scotland, the surface rock is granite and not really dissolvable by water. Here in the coastal North Highlands and on Orkney, where Highland Park is, the surface rock is sandstone and limestone, which is dissolvable by water and ends up being dissolved by the rainwater that seeps into the ground and comes up in the spring later. Not the spring, the season, but this Trarlogie Springs. Secondarily, we've got some really tall stills.
Wow.
If you happened to be an adult male giraffe and you're wandering through our still house, you'd be, your face would be about the same height as the top of our stills. The swans, like the heads of the stills, the long vertical bit, 16 feet, 10 and a quarter inches. So they're quite tall. Compare that, if you go to a lot of every distillery in Scotland's got shorter stills than us, at least in terms of single malt. You can go to some that have some incredibly short stills, and that's okay. That's what they're going for. The chemical reaction between copper and alcohol vapors is a really interesting one. You can maximize it in a tall still, or you can minimize it in a short still. It really depends on what you want your final product to taste like. Any of you who are fans of Macallan, even if you've been there, and even if you haven't, they're incredibly small, short stills with aggressively angled line arms where the still goes up and takes a left or a right, depending on what side of the room you're on. That bit's called the line arm. If it descends steeply away from the still, the draw from that still is much more rapid. If it's a gradual descent or even an ascent, it encourages more copper contact with the distillate vapors. Copper and distillate, that combination means that sulfur and sulfur compounds are grabbed out of the distillate vapors and captured by the copper. Thereby, the more copper contact, the more the fruitiness and the delicacy of a whiskey is released. That is not what everybody's going for, but it's certainly what we're going for at Glenmorangie. And this is sort of the dynamics of how that works. Lots of reflux because it's so tall, the distillate vapors start to cool before they get over the line arm, so they condense on the sides and drop back down and get redistilled, making the whiskey lighter and fruitier as a result. So from there, wood, big deal, huge deal, in as much as at least 60% of the flavor of whiskey is going to come from the cask. And the other 40% is going to come from the spirit itself. Now, that's an oversimplification. It comes from lots of different things, but the bulk of it is going to be wood derived. So we've got to be very careful what's going on with these casks. And we are, in fact, very careful. I'll show you kind of our philosophy here. Ex-bourbon oak, 90+% of the casks in Scotland full of whiskey right now had bourbon in them first. So we'd call them ex-bourbon oak casks. At Glenmorangie, we'll only use those another 2 times. So we'll call our first fill ex-bourbon oak, our second fill ex-bourbon oak, and then those casks go away. If you take a look at the other side of the screen, you may have distilleries using casks as many as 10 times. And a cask is like a big wooden tea bag. The more you use it, the less it does for you, the less it gives you in terms of extractable flavor characteristics.
Is Glenmorangie using ex-bourbon oak exclusively?
For the first 10 years of almost all our whiskey's lives, yes, they go into first and second fill ex-bourbon oak only. There are a number of one-offs and experimental cases where that's not the case, but 99% of our output goes into ex-bourbon oak right off the still, well, not right off the still, it's cut to still strength or cut to barrel strength and then into the barrel. But yes, and it's not an entirely accurate representation for original. About 60% of original is made up of first fill ex-bourbon oak and 40% is made up of second fill. And the reason for that is that the barrel is going to deliver more influence in the first fill. The distillate itself is going to deliver more influence in the second fill because the barrel is more tired, more knackered out. So that combination of the fruitiness of the distillate and the spicy vanilla, sea salt caramel, toasted coconut, pie spice character, all of the hallmarks of American oak, those combine if you combine first and second fill ex-bourbon oak and the style of distillate we make to create this lovely gem. Glenmorangie Original, that's the current label. We were just kind of showing the change in label over the last about year and a half. We've updated that labeling. I'd mentioned with Original first fill, a 10-year fill, and then there'll be some second fill. Obviously, 40% of what goes into the bottle spent 10 years in a second fill ex-bourbon cask. So we paint the ends of them different, so that you can tell. There's also barcoding, but if you go into the still house or the warehousing, you can tell which are first and which are second because the color that the end of the barrel is painted is different. So
questions.
Yeah.
So is the Scotch picking up the flavor in the first fill from the American oak or from the bourbon that used to be in that American oak?
That's an incredibly good call. What I'm going to do is I'm going to leave this slide up for just a second so people can kind of orient themselves in terms of what they might be able to expect from original. And I'll answer that question in the form of, it'll make more sense when we get to whiskey too. But when you're making decisions, determinations as a whiskey distiller, whiskey creator, in terms of what barrels you're going to choose, there are two philosophies. One is additive and the other is subtractive. If you're using ex-bourbon oak, it's more the subtractive philosophy. You're interested in what the previous occupant took out of that barrel. If you're drinking bourbon, it's tremendously influenced by wood because it's all new oak. If you're making a straight bourbon or a straight rye, it has to be by U.S. law matured in new charred white oak. And that's like using the tea bag for the first time. Corn distillate or corn rye, the standard U.S. mash bills are going to create a pretty robust distillate. Malted barley mash bills, malted barley produces a distillate that's a little bit less robust. So putting it in new oak, it tends to get buried by the new oak and starts to taste like Scottish bourbon, which we really don't want. We'd like seasoned casks. It's not just because the Scots are historically thrifty. It works out well, the relationship between malted barley distillate and seasoned oak. So bourbon represents the subtractive philosophy, but wine casks, fortified wine casks, dessert wine casks represent the additive philosophy. If you dump a bourbon barrel, that liquid has come out, it's gone into cask at 52.5 ABV or 125 proof, and it's gone typically up from there because of the maturation environment in the US. Now, so when you dump that, when you disgorge the cask, the liquid comes out, and since the liquid that was in there was so heavily made up of alcohol that it almost thoroughly evaporates even the indrik, even the stuff that was stuck in the staves of the oak evaporates, leaving very little of a signature of itself behind, very little. On the other hand, if you're dumping a wine cask, even a fortified wine cask, you're into 15 to 19 ABV. The rest of that is liquefied, what will become solids when the liquid evaporates, a lot of water, a little bit of alcohol. So you end up with a lot of dissolved residual solids stuck in the wood. It's a bit like a deglazing a pan at that point. So if you're using a sherry cask, you're looking for the influence of the previous occupant. If you're using a bourbon oak cask, you're not. You're looking for the influence of the wood, but the previous occupant is less important than the quality of the cask itself.
That's great.
Hopefully
thank you for
that answers that question.
And the answer. No,
yeah, no, that's awesome. So here we are at Glenmorangie Original, the whiskey that I used in the whiskey golf swing. So I've already added water to mine, and I'm just going to dig through this. Tasting notes are tasting notes. They don't necessarily matter. What you taste is correct. If Chobani and Teddy Grahams is just jumping out of the glass at you, then you're right. These are the distiller's tasting notes. So you can take those and sort of weigh them and set them to one side if you'd like. But you can usually identify, and hopefully it'll show up in the family of whiskeys here. I usually look for a family resemblance in Glenmorangie whiskeys by the citrus notes. And I try to track where the citrus went because we do generate a pretty citrusy and mildly floral whiskey style. So in this case, because it's all ex-bourbon oak, you could pretty well count on there being some vanilla element. Anybody that wants to send me an email and we can set up a time to talk for hours about the dynamics of American oak cask maturation and all of the cool chemicals and all the cool chemical compounds and reactions that are going on in that cask. I'd love to. Suffice it to say, vanilla, the whiskey lactone, vanilla, toasted coconut, sea salt caramel, honey. Honey's a big one. Those tend to be identifiers of ex-bourbon oak. The color too, I'd mentioned that. This is a fairly solid interpretation of American oak maturation. It's just kind of glowing golden in the glass. So compare that to Lasanta, which we'll get to if I ever shut up. This is ex-sherry oak maturation after ex-bourbon oak maturation. So the colors are going to change a lot. I'd be real surprised unless it was old to find a Scotch whiskey entirely matured in an ex-bourbon oak cask that generated that kind of color.
I have a silly question. Is the color manipulated at all? No.
At our place, the only one that would see, you can, to clarify, if you're in Scotland, even for single malt, you have, I mentioned 3 ingredients. There are 4 that are actually legal. E150A or spirit caramel is also legal. If you've been to a Scotch whiskey tasting and somebody's gotten their little vial of what looks like you'd repair a roof or a road with it, that's E150D, the stuff you'd make Coca-Cola out of. That's not legal in Scotland. E150A isolated looks like an aggressive cream soda. And you can use it. It doesn't take very much at all to.
But you folks don't use it.
We, in original, if there's any in any of our line, you'd find it in original. And it'd be a tiny amount. And it's not to make it look older than it is. It's only because original is the most widely distributed around the world. It's the most likely to be on the shelf out of its box. And so we need chromatic consistency.
Oh, consistency of color.
That's it. That's it. Now there are distillers that will use E150A to convince the eye that the whiskey is older than it is, but we certainly don't subscribe to that theory at all. If you're using that much, you start to taste it. In tiny amounts, you're not going to taste it. But if it's overdone, you begin to get a kind of a, if every Boy Scout in the world dropped every marshmallow in the world into every campfire in the world, you start to get that kind of overly caramelized or burned sugar, because it's what it is. Right. Spirit caramel is really just burnt sugar. So it is legal, and in original, we may use it from time to time, but it's a rare circumstance. For the other ones, for Lasanta, Quinta, Ruban, Nectar, and everything else in the range, that is all completely free of E150A. So, cool. And I'm glad you asked that, because that can serve to confuse from time to time. Then the rest of this, the center palate fruitiness that tends to lean into peaches and pears and pineapples and I really like drinking original and eating dried apricots. I think it's a really nice, nice marriage on the palate.
And sweet nuts maybe like macadamias or something
goodness,
like that.
Yeah, or those crazy kettled almonds, the ones where they have the thing. Those are absolutely delicious. All these whiskeys pair really nicely with charcuterie plates, with nuts, cured meats, obviously, cheeses, dried fruits, chocolate is a really lovely, sometimes pastries, and in certain desserts like this pairs incredibly well with, say, creme brulee. That's a really, really nice combination, particularly like a lemon custard or creme brulee. It's beautiful. So that's original. The reason that we start there is, it's our flagship expression, but it's also the thing that we find really important about it is that it forms the basis for the other three. So the other three are based on original for the first 10 years of their lives. We moved to Lasanta. So this is the idea, 10 years in ex-bourbon oak plus an additional 2 years in an extra maturation cask. In the case of these whiskeys, it's going to be Oloroso sherry and Pedro Jimenez sherry for Lasanta, Ruby port cask for Quinta Ruban, and Sauternes barriques for Nectar d'Or. So moving into the sherry cask finish, Lasanta. I'm going to switch this bottle around and show you the bottle.
I have to ask you a technical question on how to release the aroma. I would imagine you're not swirling it, you're just moving it in the glass. Is that correct? Or do you swirl
it? Depends. Yeah, I mean, it depends to a degree on the bottling strength. At this level, a gentle swirl is going to work great. If it's real low ABV and you're swirling like a crazy person, you're going to get a lot of evaporation out, and it's going to approach that apex of being an apology for itself in the glass, as opposed to itself, a bit sooner. But at the end of the day, total user preference. With high ABV or cask strength whiskeys, I don't do a lot of swirling because there's already a lot of high volatiles jumping out of the liquid. So I tend to not do a lot of agitating. I'll sample them.
Because the wine tasters especially, we tend to automatically swirl.
Absolutely, and that makes sense in terms of oxidization. It's a really important part of drinking wine, and that's why, just in case it came up in conversation, I'm sure you've been through this, Madeline, a million times with the folks that are joining us. I'll just get off of, no, I won't. Anyway, I'll just kind of, the reason that there's the foot here is so you can lay it on a flat surface and just rotate it around like so. So we're moving on to Lasanta. Same ABV, 43 ABV, 10 years in ex-bourbon oak. This has seen its final 2 years in a combination of Oloroso and Pedro Jimenez sherry. So if you're not familiar with sherry, it's from the Sherry Triangle in Spain, and there are loads of different types, from manzanilla, from a dry and unoxidized, almost salty manzanilla, clear through to PX or Pedro Jimenez, which was a highly oxidized and a thick, unctuous, sweet style of sherry making. We're using casks that used to hold Oloroso sherry, medium dry style, somewhat oxidized, but surprisingly not sweet when you drink it. And then some PX casks or Pedro Jimenez sherry butts. Those will be the sweet bits. So if you dig into this and it has that sort of around the perimeter of the palate, you get a little bit more of the wood spice, and down the center of the palate, you get a little bit more of the focused dried fruit characteristics. That's the Oloroso and the PX working together to create that balance on the palate. So 12 years old, 43 ABV or 86 proof in the glass. Sherried whiskeys tend to show up on the nose and palate as having that dates, figs, toffee, nuts, cake spices, cigar box, and maybe just a hint of a freshly struck match or a sulfury note. I mentioned before that the stills tend to remove sulfur characteristics, but sherry can tend to replace it because some sherries do have a certain sulfuriness to them. And Oloroso is one of those types of sherry.
This has
So
darker flavor tones.
Yes.
You know, again, I
Yeah.
tend to use wine speak, but I loved your comment about raisins and figs and, dark dried berries and plums, that type of thing, because it's a deeper, darker flavor.
Yeah, and it tends to sort of remind the palate of dried fruits, or the intensification of what's already a fruitiness, like botrytis-sized fruit, like drinking a Sauternes. You know that it was made from grape, but there's such an intensity there because of what the botrytis did in the later part of the maturation on the vine phase. It's just got more intensity to it. So that drying, whether it's an Amarone, depending on how things are dried, they just get more intense. Beautiful, beautiful whiskey. Sherried whiskeys are very popular in the US and around the world, as is evidenced by the popularity of whiskeys like Macallan. Almost all of the whiskeys that they make are fully matured in Oloroso sherry. If we tried that with a Glenmorangie distillate, full maturation in Oloroso sherry, we'd lose it to the wood because of the delicacy of the spirit. That's why their stills are so short, so that they have an oily, fiery beast of a new make spirit that goes into these highly influential sherry casks, and it has a fighting chance. It's a marriage of equals. If our light and delicate distillate tried that, we'd lose that battle in a relative hurry. So just two different ways of making whiskey. Now, Quinta Ruban, which looks a bit like this, and we'll put that over here, and then I will go back to sharing the screen so you can see the tasting notes of. Oh, I'm still sharing. So that's port cask, and then I'll show you the bottle here in just a second. Here's where the color change is significantly different, because the inside of a port cask would have been stained with red wine, as opposed to sherries are made from Palomino grapes, with the exception of PX, which is a different grape type. In Portugal, this is red grapes, and red grapes, all the pigmentation's in the skins, and that's going to end up leaching into the wine and then eventually into the wood. So what you end up with here is a thing that looks, and maybe you can see it now. I'll stop for just a second. Maybe I won't. I'll leave it. Anyway, it looks a bit like that. Color is quite reddish, copper looking. And that's just this is the one you can pick out of a lineup. Even if you didn't smell it or taste it, it's the one that looks different. The SWA, the governing body that tells people the things they can and cannot do in the creation of Scotch whiskey, one of the things that they're responsible for is making sure that Scottish whiskey maintains the historical color palette of Scotch whiskey. So you can't make a purple Scotch. You can't make a Sharkleberry Punch or Baja Blast version of Macallan. They'll tell you no. And so you can go back to them and say, okay, how far can I push it? And they usually say no farther than Quinta Ruban. So this at 46 ABV, a slightly more intense palate presence, a little bit more creaminess, a little longer length of finish, because it's the first of the non-chill filtered whiskeys that we'll have this evening. And that comes back to a conversation of lipids. That is another super geeky conversation that I love to have. But suffice it to say, if you're drinking a whiskey that's over 46 ABV and it came out of Scotland, it was not chill filtered. All of the naturally occurring fatty acids were left in solution. If it was bottled at under 46 ABV, some, most, or all of those lipids would have been removed because of the relationship between lipids and the potency of the alcohol and water solution that they live in. It's a visuals thing, and it can manifest itself as a texture thing. So it's just something to keep in mind.
How
And
was this appearing to you, Rebecca? I was just going to turn to you, and do you have a question, or did you want to comment on this?
I have a quick question. The tasting pack in Chicago has the 12-year Quinta Ruban.
Oh, nice.
Yeah,
Very
so,
cool.
Like, what's the difference in?
Yep. That's great. The first difference is we're not making that anymore. And I love that Black Label 12-year. It was my favorite of the four for many, many years. And I'm hoarding bottles when I can find them. The difference is that the mathematics on that was very similar, just like the Lasanta, 10 years in ex-bourbon oak, 2 years in first fill ruby port cask. It's not so simple anymore now that the Green Label Quinta is a 14-year. It's not 10 plus 4. It's most of it is 12 plus 2. A little bit older base, and then 2 years in ruby port cask. You're going to find some 13 and 1 and some 11 and 3, but what you won't find is 10 and 4, because what we discovered is that 4 years for a Glenmorangie in a ruby port cask is too long, and we'll lose it to the wood. The balance it gets a little bit shot at that point. So Madeline, you had pointed out that the intensity, the fruitiness in Lasanta intrigued you. This to me goes into that plums and red currants, dark cocoa kind of a cedar sort of end of that spectrum to me.
Rebecca, how about you? I'm curious what you're perceiving. This seems extraordinarily mellow to me, and I love the description of cocoa powder.
Yeah, I agree. It's mellow and like a dark sort of dusty chocolate. But maybe it's just, perception, but I feel like I get the dark fruits, like the dark cherry from the ruby port casks. Certainly offset from the more like nutty toffee of the sherry. It's hard. I can't decide which I like better between the Lasanta and the
You can like them both. Yeah.
I like them both. Yeah.
That's the nutty comment is a really, really good one for sherried whiskeys. I think the nuttiness is distinct, whereas with Quinta Ruban, it's not quite so nut oils. I don't get quite as much of that with Quinta Ruban. This one with water, you may or you may not find that its mintiness, and you can see the reference there in the slide. Its mintiness tends to show up on the exhale after water has gone in. It's it's much harder to find, particularly in the 12-year that you all have. It's much harder to find before water, and it's almost hard to ignore once the water has gone in.
I really enjoy tasting it both ways, so that's been a revelation to me.
Yeah, and what's cool about adding water to whiskey is that it's a reminder that it isn't a thing that you just subject yourself to. There are decisions that you make, aesthetics decisions, and the treatment of the liquid that allow you to shade it in ways that maximize the enjoyment because you understand your palate, and you have these ways of manipulating the liquid that may benefit your or enhance your relationship with the liquid in ways that make your palate especially happy. Then that's entirely under your control. So if we move from there to Sauternes, okay, so this is Nectar d'Or. I'm just going to pop that into my secondary window there. Is it there? It isn't there. There it is. Nectar d'Or sees its final period of maturation. So recently, this lost its age statement. So if yours in the taster packs that you all have, it's probably still a 12-year. It probably still says the number 12 on it.
Yeah, it does.
This is the same stuff. The only reason that we took the number off was because we started to build an age and price tier ladder between original Lasanta and Quinta Ruban at 14. The 14 Quinta Ruban didn't change price. It's the same price that it was when it was a 12 label, Black Label 12. But now we've got this 14-year that sits in the approximately $60 a bottle range. And if we still had a 12 on the Nectar d'Or bottle, it sits at about $80 on the shelf. So it's quite confusing to see a company that puts a 14-year-old whiskey out $20 cheaper than one of their 12-year expressions. So we took the number off to keep from confusing the hell out of people, but the process is exactly the same. So fundamentally, and I can't say full on because the SWA would yell at me that it's 12 plus 2, but we didn't change our process. So this final period of maturation technically is going to be in first fill Sauternes barriques. And here's what's cool about Sauternes barriques, aside from everything. The only uncool thing about them is how expensive they are. They're good, $1,200, $1,300 a piece empty. So what we end up with is one of those additive principles of a dessert wine cask created in France from French oak. And French oak, if you compare it to American oak in terms of its structure, it's much more tannic. Oak lignin, the thing that generates that oak lactone, the recognizable American oak lactone, the whiskey lactone. French oak has 80% less lignin in it than American oak does. And so what it lacks in lignin, it makes up for in heartwood extractants, tannins, robustness, a certain amount of grappliness on the tongue. I tend to find that the influence of French oak, particularly in whiskeys, I feel it like a broad sensation of a high definition tingle all across my tongue, drying, astringent tingle, really pleasant, but a drying, astringent tingle. And what's nice about that is that it balances the dessert wine aspects of this whiskey with that really cool. It's like a teeter-totter. If the fulcrum point in this massive whiskey teeter-totter is original, and it sits there in the middle, then the two kids playing on the playground, one of them is French oak tannins, and the other one is dessert wine. So you end up with this beautifully balanced. It's a bit like original with a couple of extra chapters at the end, and a little bit more
mid-palate. I'm interrupting just because I'm excited about what you're saying, that teeter-totter business, because mid-palate, to me, there's a sweetness to this wine, and Scotch, and I love that. I love the descriptions. Of course, it's feeding it to me, but I relate to white chocolate and honey, but then the finish is not sweet.
Right.
I have to mention to everyone, I know we're running a little bit over time, but Dan's going to hang with us a bit. Everyone's been enjoying you tremendously, so please don't run away. But I want to encourage everyone to pipe up and unmute if you have a question or a comment on any of these scotches. But seriously, this has been so illuminating, and I really appreciate your generosity in mentioning other Scotch styles and houses. It does nothing but elevate our respect for Glenmorangie,
Well, to your point, there are 130 plus distilleries in Scotland. That number changes nearly daily. Not this year, but it will continue to change in the future. Every one of them is telling their story, and their story is wonderful and beautiful and legitimate. And it's a story worth reading. It's a story worth being told. All these things are tales being told across generations and across cultures and history and time in the language inside your head. You don't need to understand the language. You don't need to grow up there. You get to visit there and have them speak to your head in liquid, nonverbal tones that make sense to you because it's a story that's being translated in your own internal language. It's so connective and magic that it's almost mind-boggling. Like I just mentioned, Bill Matheson's 100 and whatever, 80 odd wedding anniversaries next week. He's still here telling you this story. He never went anywhere. It's like listening to a Bowie record. He hasn't died. He's still in your head. All that stuff is still sitting there in your head, and the messages are just as clear as they were 187 years ago.
This is absolutely delicious. Before we get comments from Rebecca on some other Glenmorangie scotches available at Plum, taking us just for a moment, if you don't mind, to champagne, if that's okay with you.
Oh, yeah.
Because for those of you who have to peel off, we did a pop-up. We put this together in 1 hour today. We're going to do a champagne tasting next Friday, 6:30 Central, so just a half an hour earlier. And I hope you join us because, we've got to toast to each other at the end of this bizarre year. And it will help us float into next year. But we're featuring 3 champagnes, but you can, per usual with our virtuals, join with whatever you like. In Michigan, we're doing this on Thursday. So different champagnes, the Michiganders who are listening, 6:30 Eastern on Thursday, and you'll get that invitation 6:30 Central in Chicago next Thursday and Friday. And I'm going to, if you don't mind, transition quickly to Rebecca, who can tell us, and you can comment on the other Glenmorangie options in the store. Go for it, Rebecca.
Yeah, so in Old Town, we also have the 15-year Cadboll Estate, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing all this correct, right, which is a estate-grown barley.
Perfectly done, yes.
Go. In that blue box right there.
That's all first fill ex bourbon oak, just so we're on the same page.
Cool. We also have a tail of cake, which is if you like the Nectar door, my understanding is this would be right up your alley.
Certainly would.
Yeah, we limited amount of that. And that's Tokai.
Yep. So that sees its final period of maturation in Hungarian royal Tokai casks. So that's Hungarian oak, and things get weird and funky there too. But it's a beautiful dram bottle at 46 ABV, non-chill filtered. Just really lovely stuff.
And the Astar. Am I saying that right? Astar.
Great. You're doing great.
A limited edition. Yeah. Gaelic is not a good language for me.
The one that you'll see in the store has a little emblem that says 2017 right there. This was the one from 2009, but just look for the little 2017 emblem right there.
Another limited edition, the Tusail.
Lovely. That's here.
And these
that one
are
looks like that.
About 100 in the Old Town store.
So special Christmas or holiday gifts.
Exactly.
Yes.
And then finally the 18 year, which is a little bit more, but right, is all 18 or minimum 18 year aged.
You know what? I'm going to do an unkind thing, but Robin, are you taking off, or are you still there? I didn't know if you have a range of Glenmorangie scotches in Michigan you want to mention, and if you aren't in a position to do that, what we can do is email it on our follow-up. Robin is our spirits buyer in Michigan, so I just wanted to mention that. Yes. Yeah. And I want to know if you give away giraffes.
We don't, and sometimes we get asked if we have this very realistic sort of Muppet giraffe that we roll out sometimes at Glenmo, and people are like, "That's cruel. They don't live in Scotland. It's not real." So don't write us letters. I mean,
Robin, do you want to jump in about anything about the Michigan set with Glenmorangie, or should we just email it to folks afterwards? If you can unmute yourself quick. Oops, let's see if she can do it. She's figuring it out. She might not be able to figure it out. That's okay. That's all right. Don't worry about it. We'll do it afterwards. I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but I'm glad everyone got to see your beautiful face.
There is giraffe conservation, though, right? I mean, there's that we have some tips. Yeah.
Yep, you can get involved in the Giraffe Conservation Fund, GCF, I want to say, via those tins, the gift tins that look like this. Oh crap, I have one right here. That there are, I believe, some connection to. I'm supporting, not like Adopt a Giraffe, but I contribute to that fund as well. So we aren't, the giraffe thing is more than just a symbol. We want to see the future of the species, intact.
Any questions for Dan from the Academy, from anyone? You can unmute, you can comment on the scotches. I'm dying to know if you have any preferences and why. Jeff opined, actually, our ranking leader.
Actually, Madeline, thank you always for all these events. They're just wonderful. I was very surprised because I preferred the original and the Nectar d'Or with water very, very much, but had an extremely strong preference for the Lasanta and the Quinta Ruban without water.
Huh.
I don't know if Daniel has, and I agree with you that you're just right with what you like.
Yep.
I was surprised that was the case, and I was checking alcohol levels and all the rest. I don't know if you have a comment on that. I especially wanted to thank you for the Bowie comment. And most importantly, I was fairly obsessed with David Bowie. But I'm also curious for your the tasting notes on the 18 year. Because these are so delicate. They're so delicate that I'm sort of wondering what happens over 18 years. And I guess I should just try myself, right?
Yep, but the thing is, let me back into all those. First of all, Black Star is one of the most amazing records I've ever heard in my whole life. Second of all, the water thing. I agree with you on original and on Nectar. Nectar is one that I go either way with, but original, I do tend to lean on the water a little bit, because unlike most single malt Scotch whiskies, the addition of water to original brings out more interesting fruit elements. It doesn't suppress it like it usually does in most whiskeys. It becomes softer. it becomes creamier and more less pear, more pineapple, more peach. And so I think water and original is terrific. I tend to avoid it almost like the plague in Lasanta and Quinta because I just find that the balance, those balance points, I feel like water, and you're a music guy, I feel like water is like messing with the EQ on a stereo. You can, if you broke into somebody's house while they were at work and you messed with the EQ on the stereo and they came back and they were listening to Don't Stop Believing or whatever, and then they turn it on again, they recognize it's the same song. But it sounds different because you've changed the structural pillars of its sonic signature are being delivered.
EQ?
Oh, sorry. Like if you you see like the bass knob or the treble knob, sometimes you'll see it as a full graphic EQ, and sometimes you'll see it just as a tone knob. The sonic signature is being presented to your ears in different intensities per pillar of sonic signature. Just like with whiskey, with water added, you've messed with it's like a bar graph. The intensity of the flavor or aromatic pillars, each of them has been adjusted a little bit by the addition of water. You recognize it as basically the same whiskey, but it's being presented to you with a different palate and aromatic signature.
Well, Eric, you're the expert is confirming
18.
your perception. And 18, he wants to hear about 18.
Yeah. So with 18, we're back to 43 ABV. It has seen a mild chill filtration. But the cool thing about 18, if you compare it to Lasanta, both are influenced by Lasanta Sherry, but in different ways. Every drop of Lasanta sees its final 2 years in some type of sherry cask, either Oloroso or PX. With 18 year, only about 30% of what goes into the bottle ever saw the inside of a sherry cask. The other 70% stays in ex-bourbon oak throughout. So what you end up with is a more subtle sherry picture on the palate, but it's a 3-year finish instead of 2. So it's a subtle intensity. It's a dichotomy on the palate. You've got almost a toffeed richness on the back palate that adds another gear or a curtain of toffiness that lives on the back of the palate as you're enjoying 18 year. But with sherry influence can become a real playground bully and start to take over a whiskey with relative ease. In this case, we forced it to play a bit part when it's usually the stage hog. So and the way that we did that was to limit how much went into sherry. So 70% ex-bourbon oak, 30% that goes 15 years in ex-bourbon oak, 3 years in Oloroso. And that extra 8 years over original, reactive oxidization in the glass. One of the things that happens is softening of the relative solventy nature of new make, but there's also an esterification phase in the barrel. So a lot of esterification it's the fruitiness. A lot of that's going to be formed in the fermentation phase via the reaction between acids and alcohols that the yeast is interacting with. In the barrel, wood acids and alcohols create new types of ester. So there's an increased complexity in aged whiskeys. Now the balance point is, when does the wood take over? That's the knife's edge in Scotch whiskey is not older is inherently better because it just gets more complex. The wood can begin to dominate. You're looking for a balance between the wood influence and the distillate influence and the influence of time and place and all of those interesting things. But one of those components, and it's usually wood, after a certain number of years takes over, it becomes like gnawing on furniture. It's far too astringent and far too woody. So for me, it's about 18 to 25 where you get that sweet spot where the development of the maturation-based esterification and the complexity building oxidization in the cask come to a rich and beautiful head. And then you start to lose those, not always, then some whiskeys start to lose themselves to the wood. The wood wins that battle. And so a 40-year-old whiskey, it's rare that it's really, really, really good. When they're painfully expensive. But when you get to that age, it's a lot of time to be that close to wood as an alcohol water combo. And wood's got a bunch of soluble elements to it. So it ends up flavoring the hell out of that whiskey. So that's to me, it's complexity.
Eric and Dan, you held our hands through a really fascinating rabbit hole, I would tell you. But thank you for taking us down it. And actually, I'm being pesky and asking a question because you mentioned cheese, and all cheeses are not equal.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Right.
you know, I'm always telling people, you know, the whole thing with red wine is perfect with cheese is, you know, conventional wisdom that we need to kick a little bit because it depends on the red wine and depends on the cheese. Do you have favorite cheeses with Scotch in general? I mean, to my sensibility, I would frankly reach for something a little softer and gentler, even a triple creme, but I might be dead wrong about that. Could you opine, please?
Yeah, definitely. To me, it depends on whether the whiskey's peated or not. Peated whiskeys, blue cheese, cheddar cheeses, sharp cheeses, aggressive, you know,
Reggiano,
sort of.
right?
Yeah, yes. For whiskeys like Glenmorangie, you're right. Soft white cheeses, you know, Munsters and Bries and things like that are beautiful with this style of whiskey making. But if you've got a big sharp cheddar or blue cheese or Gloucester, is Gloucester blue cheese? Those can overwhelm. It's difficult to achieve a balance, but with a whiskey like Ardbeg or Lafroig or whatever, you can throw some pretty gnarly cheeses at those, and
So
it's
the peat
beautiful.
level is the factor. No, that's
I think so.
so
Yeah, the
sensible.
ABV and peating will have a lot to do with what cheeses work with your whiskey.
Now, I have to tell everyone it's 25 after 8 in Michigan, 25 after 7 in Chicago. Any last minute comments, suggestions, enthusiasm? I know that there's a collective wave of thanks to you for truly an intriguing time. It was wonderful.
Awesome.
And thank you for being yourself and letting your spirit sing through, which, you know, makes your, all your knowledge really, you know, multidimensional, Dan.
Thank you. Thanks very much. That was a lot of fun. And I'm just in case, I'm at Glenmo Dan on Instagram. So if you've got any follow-up, any notes that you want to send my way, any feedback, positive or negative, drop me a DM on Instagram, and I will read the hell out of it. Because I love these kinds of things because they bring this to life, and it gives us an opportunity to remind you that this is supposed to be a relationship between you and this, and it's a unique relationship that only you and it can have.
Well said. Well, Michigan and Chicago, thank you profusely. We can't wait to hear about your walking through your fear and attaining that credential, and setting the stage for everyone else having to have a sense of humor and wit. So to remind everyone, I hope you enjoyed yourself. You seem to.
Plum Market, thank you guys for everything that you've done. Rebecca, Kelly, thank you for everything that you've done. Madeline, this was a lot of fun. It was great meeting you and getting to know you. The folks in Michigan, my brother lives in Detroit, and I have a fondness for Detroit. So thank you for the opportunity, and thanks for joining us and spending your evening with us.
And Christophe Gaillard made candied pecans earlier, and it goes very well with the nectar.
Oh, I bet it does. That sounds amazing.
So on that, so chin chin to everyone. Please stay healthy. Please stay safe. I love these tastings because they make us feel, you know, we're not as lonely. We get to see each other, and there's nobody in the back of the room. We're all together. And if you like raising a glass of bubbles next week, please join us on Thursday or Friday. And that includes you too, Dan. You know,
thank you.
if you like bubbles, come on in. Okay.
I love them.
Cheers, everybody. Have a good evening and a safe, cheerful weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madeline.
Don't
Thank
forget
you,
about
Morgan.
This
Ziggy
was
and the
excellent.
Thin
Thank
White
you,
too.
Dan.
Oh,
What are we
sure.
not forgetting, Eric? What did you say?
Don't forget about Ziggy and the Thin White Duke.
Yes,
Oh, my
yes.
goodness.
Fantastic
You
records,
didn't,
all
wait
of
a
them.
minute. You
Thank
didn't
you.
tell
Thank
us
you. Good night.
what instrument do you play?
I'm a drummer. I
Oh,
studied
my.
percussion in college, orchestral music, and so on and so forth. But I've played drums since I was 12.
Fantastic.
It's a lot of fun.
Good night, all. Thank you. Good night.
Take good care.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.
Good night. Thanks, guys.